have to have all the extra stuff on this one because I actually have my notes where I can find them. So we're going to talk about typographic genius in the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution. The 18th century just created a lot of things happened in the 18th century. I mean, if you look back at history, the 18th and 19th centuries were huge developments in the Industrial Revolution happened. World War I and World War II led to other developments in industrialized countries. So there was just a ton of stuff. If you think about what happened in the last 100 years, my great-grandmother left Missouri in a covered wagon when she was 16 in 1925. And no, not even then, it was like 1915. So she left Missouri in a covered wagon. Of course, they had cars. My great-grandfather worked for the railroad. And then, so there would have been the things that happened in her lifetime were just an incredible amount of changes. And so then she traveled by car. She never learned how to drive, but she traveled in cars and then flew in airplanes to see her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren before she died when she was 90. So just a ton of changes in that 100-year period. And the 18th century was not really unlike that. Electricity, running water, plumbing, those kinds of things all happened, which changed health conditions all around the world. Places that don't have running water and plumbing and sanitation services still have diseases or more common diseases than what we have in industrialized areas. So there's a lot of changes that happened, but leading into that, like we talked about in the last class, as the middle class started to be educated and learn to read, the demand for books became greater. So in the 18th century, typefaces began to be developed. And part of this was to create typefaces that could fit, they were more easily readable and fit in those rows on the printing presses so that they could get more letters on a page and more words on a page and reduce the amount of paper, the number of passes through the press, all of those things happened. So in 1692, Louis XIV ordered the establishment of a committee of scholars to develop a new type for the Royal Printing Office. The new letters were to be designed by scientific principles. And we saw a little bit of this last time in the letters from Albrecht Dührer's type manual. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci had done the same thing. A square was divided into a grid of 64 units, creating graphic standards for the new alphabet. In 1702, this is the Medaille Folio. It was the first book to feature these new kinds of typefaces. And you can see there's it's more easily readable. The structure is different than black letter. If you compared the same text to black letter type, black letter can be really difficult to read. This is much easier. At the same time, the art world was changing, and art was no longer just something that was commissioned by the church. People had money. They were able to pay artists to do pieces that were more about their lifestyles or about their imagined lifestyles, because quite honestly, I doubt that this scene happened because there are little cherubs in the background. But this is a Jean-Honore Fragonard piece from 1767, 1768. Everything in this period of time became very elaborate and ornate. The artwork was the same. The furniture, my ex-husband's aunt loved this kind of stuff. She had all kinds of it in her house, which is reproduced, still in some places. If you see in the movie Crazy Rich Asians, the roommate's house is full of this kind of stuff. This is a performance of John Gay's Beggar's Opera. This was the first an experience that became more common in this time frame. Spectators were walking around during the play, chatting with friends, talking to the actors. Wealthy audience members could actually sit on the stage, and as a way of displaying their status. To be able to do that, they were able to talk with the actors and actresses and show off their nice clothing. So obviously people had more money. It was not such a division between the royalty and then common people. It began to be more levels of society. This is another type specimen from Pierre-Simon Fournier-Lejeune from 1768. It's not the greatest picture, but you can still see the typeface itself and the structure of it. These were more like initial caps on this page. They would be used to begin a paragraph, not necessarily. These were not used for pages of type that were for readability. The same designers, manual Typographic from 1764 and 1768 was considered a masterwork of Rococo design. And you can see here again, the same kind of ornate work around the edges. The letters, the capital letters themselves from the previous, so you see these capital letters with the designs in them repeated in these pages for headlines and just used as display faces. This is the title page for another one of his books, Ariel, A Mode of Music. So it was a music textbook type piece, and this was the cover page. Again, using multiple borders. And after watching, how the printing press worked, you could see they would have been using these bars and creating some of these borders, and then also some of them would have been created for probably the book itself, or for books all set up the same size and used at different times. This is a 2-page spread from Jean de La Fontaine's, I'm gonna give up on that title, from 1762, printed by Joseph Gerard Barbeau and illustrated by Charles Eisen. To adorn the poem about a painter's romantic interlude with his subject, Barbeau used Eisen's etching, a topical tailpiece by Chaffard, which would be the little piece at the bottom of the right-hand page, and then Fournier-Lejeune's ornamented type. And notice the borders around the page as well. That was partially because of the printing process itself, and the pages were over and over would be used in the same size, but the pieces would be set inside. And it creates a really nice framed effect on the page. And this is a black and white print. Some of these are, clearly not the best resolution, but you can still see the designs and the type. Black and white print of an engraved trading card by Robert Clee from 19th century. It's owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and gifted to them in 1927. But the piece has these borders that would have been all artwork that was etched onto a plate, and then the type would have been done inside with hand-done type on top of that. Bickham himself was a writing master and engaged 25 other masters of penmanship to contribute to this highly useful guide to the businessman of calligraphy, ornament, and letter forms. The universal penman is rarely found intact, as it was often split to allow many clerks to practice at the same time. This was a guide and used to teach letter forms and how to write with all those swirly embellishments. It's a really pretty page. This is a type specimen from William Caslon, and you have Caslon, you should have it on your computers. It's one of the standard typefaces on a Mac, but this is the use of Caslon in all of its different sizes, italics, different forms used, and then the borders at the bottom. So this was like almost like an advertisement of what kind of typefaces could be found at the Caslon Letter Foundry. And this is just a type specimen page that was designed similar to what we do in typography when you guys make the type specimen books. John Baskerville. There are very few biographical notices of John Baskerville's type. Most of them were found after his death. Baskerville came to typesetting and printing at the age of 50 after making a fortune in japanned wares. He was born in Worcestershire. He began his career as a writing master and moved on to stone cutting. The Cambridge Press printed a biography of Baskerville, which talks about all of this, but there are only 2 firmly attributed surviving examples of his work, and modern scholarship has reduced this to 1, which is this slab of slate with 5 lines of Roman, Italic, and Gothic lettering. Gravestones cut in any of the hands by John Baskerville, writing master. That's what it says. So he created the typeface, but also then did the stone engraving using other typefaces. But this was a plate to advertise. And this is the Baskerville typeface. Also on your computers, it survived. This is an early infographic printed in a book in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this is around the time when we start to see charts and information put into visual formats, not just words. And this is another Baskerville sample. A little bit hard to read. It's hard to find larger images of some of these. I should have shrunk it. And borders, more of those fancy Rococo borders still being used later in the 17th century and early 18th century. There were strips, bars that could go into the plates. This is Giambattista Bedoni. It's an image of him, but also the stamp from the Italian stamp, postage stamp that was created to honor him in 1963, using his typeface also on your computers. These are samples of Bedoni. You can see it has the really strong, heavy downstrokes on one side, and the real thin lines, like on the A. The serifs are very thin. And this is a design made with an updated version of Bedoni. Around that time, printing was used in combination methods where type was added after illustrations were printed using a different process. And these were more books created more for children, which was a new introduction. But this book itself is similar. Blake is the author, the writer, and I believe illustrator as well. But this was stories that had a similarity to Aesop's fables. Bad picture there. That one. This is an engraving that was done and printed of Shakespeare. I don't know how realistic it is, if it was supposed to exactly depict him or not, of him writing and the people learning from him. Another illustrated page, the etching was done and the plate set, how we saw in the video the other day. They would lock everything into place, and so the etching would be placed at the top, the plate for that, and then the type underneath. The Industrial Revolution's innovations in typography led to faster pace and mass communication needs of an increasingly urban industrialized society, produced a rapid expansion of jobbing printers, advertising, and posters. These had a larger scale and visual impact, and they were often posted on walls, and just like we still do, you know, like everybody texts stuff up everywhere. The 26 letters of the alphabet transferred these signs into abstract visual forms, projecting powerful concrete shapes of strong contrast and large size from the billboards. Originally called billboards because they were like playbills, and bills was the term used for signs that people would post. And they were larger than books and printed on larger materials. These display faces were used in different combinations. In part, this is a more contemporary one, probably done on a letterpress machine like we saw in the video. But part of the reason for the change of typefaces was necessity, like they talked about also in the video. There were only so many letters of everything, and so they would use what they had. So if in the first 3 words they used up all of the A's, then in the next word they might change the letter form. And you can see that in this poster in the middle. Some of it for design, but a lot of it was just necessity. These were called 2-line letters because they filled up 2 lines of type, so they made a heading. And there's different sizes, and we've got a narrower one, smaller. Another display face. That's what all of these are, early display faces that were created. Some of these are still, forms of them are still in use today as display faces. These types of typefaces were created out of wood blocks. And I have some examples of some wood type posters. So this is one where you can see at the top, the first line even has 2 different typefaces in it. The C is big and blocky, and then the rest of the word is made with these narrow letters. The M and the D in Maryland are created with different sizes to block in the letters there. And then Day uses a different typeface. So each line may be different. They use the same one in multiple places, but they're not all consistent. In Balto and Potomac, you have the first letter of each word in a bolder typeface. Likely a necessity in the sense that the B for Baltimore maybe wasn't available in the other typeface, or the P wasn't available, and so they used it as the first letter and then continued with the narrower letters for the rest of the word. And these were set on presses similar to what we saw the other day, and then it would roll. Generally, these would be rolled through a big press, like the etching press that we saw, but a larger one. Another sample of wood type, different styles of letters on each line, the border around Houdini. This was announcing a week's worth of events, what was happening on different days, and using the different typefaces on each line. larger type that was used for these playbills and posters was not, they didn't have trays and trays of these letters because they were large, they were expensive to produce. If they were lead, they were very expensive. A lot of them were created out of wood blocks, and so they didn't have as many copies of those letters themselves. Another one. And it's a style that's copied as retro or vintage style now. This is a specimen of wood type, so you have all the different letters that would be available. This is actually, I think, a more modern version, but it's doing the same thing as what a wood type poster would have done, that would have displayed what letters were available for use. I don't think there really was a Yeehaw Industrial Letterpress Company, but it shows how these were put together. We saw in the video the other day, as printing progressed, one of the newer methods was the steam-powered offset press using the rollers, and the paper never actually touched the plate. So they created a plate, it rolled around the press, and the was inked and then transferred the text to the paper. It was a much faster process than the Gutenberg press. Also in the 1700s, late 1700s, the Mergenthaler typesetting machine was created, and it allowed typesetting to become a more automated process. The Mergenthaler typesetting machine was in existence in some form with updates into the late 80s and probably early 90s still. So it lived a long life, was in use in different forms. And this is a newer version of a Mergenthaler typesetting machine. So the typesetter would sit at that keyboard and type in the words from the manuscript, and then it would set it into column sizes, various sizes, and everything. It was really, we used to order type that was set this way, and we'd have to spec the type. So I'd have to tell them what size, basically all the stuff you do in InDesign or in Illustrator, you had to do it by, you had to write it out on your document and let them know what size you wanted it, how much leading, if you wanted it flush left or flush right or centered, what typeface. They had type specimen books that they sent out. And so each typesetter had a library of typefaces, and you had to use their library. If you needed a different typeface, you had to go to a different typesetter to get it. So it was still limiting. You have way more typefaces available to you than you actually need today. But also, that's one of the benefits of the computer.